The information provided on this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your qualified health provider with any questions you may have. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. Reliance on any information provided here is solely at your own risk.
Welcome. This is Birth, Baby. Your hosts are Sierra Morgan and Samantha Kelly. Sierra is a birth doula, hypnobirthing educator, and pediatric sleep consultant.
Samantha is a birth doula, childbirth educator, and lactation counselor. Join us as we guide you through your options for your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support. If you enjoy our content, please be sure to like, follow, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps us gain visibility to other people that could benefit from listening in. Hello, everyone. Today we have Dr. Mona Amin. She is a board-certified general pediatrician. She is an IBCLC, online parenting educator, and mother. She has been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Good Morning America, Parents.com, and ABC Nightly News. And she's even here talking to us, through her brand, PedsDocTalk, which she has an amazing Instagram. Go over there. Her goal is to provide relatable and easy to digest guidance for the modern parent regarding child health, development, and parenting. Her platform aims to guide parents in a mindful way to bring more confidence and calm into their parenting journey. And that is why we have her here today, because we want to talk about BMIs and our kiddos. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for that intro and for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, we are so excited to talk about this as a hot button topic across the board from birth to, death, but we're going to focus on kids here today. So to start us off, can you tell us how is the way modern healthcare systems approach weight in pediatric visits problematic?
Ooh, I love this starting point. And for me, I am very into the early foundation of children and their mental and physical health. And so from the beginning, when a baby is born, we obviously, a lot of us announce the baby's weight, right? Like, hey, I had a baby and my baby's 6 pounds, 12 ounces or whatever. And it's literally attached to the child's name when they're born. And if you think about it, there's no reason why anybody else besides the parent and the doctor need to know the baby's weight. And yet that is what we've culturally done, to put weight on this pedestal from the moment a child is born. And
that goes before
yes.
the child's born. We're birth doulas. So we start hearing about it at like the 20-week anatomy scan when we're hearing what percentile they are in the womb. So it's
and
crazy.
How much anxiety that causes, right? I mean, I'm sure you've had clients or, families come in and they're like, well, my child is, tracking at the 40th or 30th and they're worried because their kid's not bigger. And I'm like, oh, well, every baby's going to be different here. And the most important thing is that we look at trends, what the baby's doing, the health of the baby. And so what I worry about with the modern healthcare system is that not only clinicians, but also parents have become so focused on numbers. So you look at numbers, you look at weight, you look at this, you look at percentiles versus the overall big picture of a baby, of a child. And so when we look at weight, we look at numbers more than lifestyle, more than feeding, more than development. And that can lead you down a slippery slope of thinking that something is wrong with your child or baby, when in actuality, every human being comes in a different body build, comes in a different weight from the moment they are in utero and then they're finally born. And when we look at that, I think it's so important for clinicians to really be mindful of how they approach the discussion of weight, right? Using terminology like failure to thrive, which has now lost favor in how we communicate that, or obesity or overweight, right? We have to look at how a child is doing overall before we put on these labels, which can really attach a lot of negative perception for parents and make them worry unnecessarily about the health of their child.
It's interesting too, because it trickles down to the kid. They are in these appointments. They are hearing these things. I remember as a little girl, I was the heaviest of all of my friends. I remember kind of like my mom trying to encourage me into the one-piece bathing suit instead of the two-piece, because in her mind, I would be embarrassed, but she didn't, she wasn't trying to be mean. That's just, I was raised in the 80s and the early 90s, And so when people hear 30th percentile or 50th, or I was in like the 90 something, what are these percentiles and are they useful? Are they useful in some ways and not in others? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so percentiles, how they're done, there's going to be different ones around the world, but the World Health Organization has their own percentiles, and then the CDC is what we're using in America. And they basically take and compare children across various socioeconomic statuses, ethnicities, and then also you have one for boys, one for girls. There's a growth chart for certain medical conditions like Down syndrome. Premature babies get their own growth curve. But what we're looking at is a percentile of comparison, if you will. And so when you say that your child is the 40th percentile, we are saying that your child, if it's born a female, so your child who's born a female is larger than 40% of peers at that age that are also female. So a percentile of 80 is you're bigger than 80% of children that age. But the negative thing about percentiles is that it doesn't take into account true genetic distribution, right? So you're looking at a broad sense. And to be honest, the CDC curves don't really take into consideration the true diversity of America. And it lumps together breastfed, formula fed, it lumps together all ethnicities. And I use the example, I'm Indian American. Indian babies are very petite. We're very, very petite. And so if we were going to be put on that curve, most of my friends and their children are coming out to be underweight on the curve. My own children are very healthy, but they are underweight. I grew up being labeled underweight when I ate well, exercised, and did all that. On the flip side, we see African-American or Black children who by body build are just very, very on the higher end of percentile. And they're being labeled as overweight when in actuality, they are just built differently. And so I use those examples because percentiles can be helpful when we look at it as a trend. So what I'm looking at is the child growing on their curve in height, weight, head circumference, not are you on the 80th versus the 40th, or are you on the 20th versus the 60th? Because that is when we deal with comparison. That is when we deal with, well, what's wrong with my child? Why are they not on the 100th? Which is what I've been asked in my visits. And I'm like, no, this isn't a grade. This is a trend that we're looking at. What I want to see is your child trending where they have before? Maybe they were the 8th percentile and now they're the 15th and now they're the 6th and now they're the 8th again. So the trends matter way more where your child is doing on that versus where they are on the actual curve. And the reason why we talked about at the beginning, when we get so bogged down into percentiles and numbers, the psychology behind this is that parents will see the number, they'll see the percentile, they'll hear that it's low, like less than 50. I don't know why parents feel like it has to be over 50, and they'll feel like something's wrong. And what I approach it as is, I'm not going to tell you the percentile. If you want to hear it, that's fine. But let me tell you, I need to tell you how they grew from last visit. They gained 2 pounds since the last visit, which is wonderful. They grew inches. And this is what I care about, the trajectory more than the actual number, because that is when we start to get into those body image issues. And, oh, well, my kid is this weight. And what do I need to do to gain weight or lose weight? And then we get down that really dark path of feeling like our kids are not perfect enough when they actually are.
It's so wild because when you look at people, but it's specifically children, and you see like how, all of these kids, like my son is playing baseball right now, and the boys on his team all are very active. Some of them are, really, really good at baseball. Some of them are not really all that great at baseball quite yet, but they all have such different body types, but they're all like moving and doing the exact same things. And some of the kids that are a little bit bigger on that team are like way better than my little one who looks like he would be really good at baseball.
Yeah, yes.
And it just doesn't matter. Like at this age, like are they eating right? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Okay, great. Like,
yeah,
it's hard.
And it's helpful that we have them, because if your kid was in the 90th percentile and that's been their norm, and all of a sudden they go to a checkup and they're in the 20th, let's chat. Mm-hmm. Like that is a marker for us to look deeper. It's not just in and of itself this determining factor, right? It's just, do we need to look deeper or do we not?
Yeah, and that is exactly it. I'm looking at steep drop-offs from visit to visit. And then obviously based on what's going on, it's a conversation on, like you said, depending on the age of the child, what's going on with feeding. So whether it's breast or formula in infancy, if it's nutrition after that age, and then also lifestyle, right? So you're speaking of like school age children or older, what is the physical activity like? And like you said perfectly, it is a really important thing. We're not going to ever give it up because it can give me really good information on knowing if I need to dive in further on endocrine conditions like thyroid issues, diabetes, cholesterol, like things is there something else I need to work up as to why we're seeing steep weight loss, steep weight, weight gain, because that is something that can be very useful information. And then that is another conversation, like you said, that is so important to have.
Absolutely. So what about BMI? What do you feel about BMI? Do you feel like it's something that's really helpful for where we're at, or do you feel like it's not as beneficial for our society today?
I don't think it has any utility. This is my personal opinion. And I like to explain what BMI is for anyone who's not familiar. So it's your body mass index, and it's a person's weight in kilograms divided by the square of their height in meters. So it's fancy math, but there's BMI calculators online. And most recently, the American Medical Association, so this is for mainly adults, issued new guidelines on how the metric should be used, saying it's not a good measure for body fat, and it's actually based more on historical data from white populations. So like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't take into consideration the way our bodies are built differently if we're certain ethnicities. So I mentioned like African American, their body composition has way more muscle mass. So if you're going by BMI, you could have a very high BMI because it doesn't pick up fat, it picks up just the weight. I use the example, like I'm very thin framed, but because I'm lifting weights, I weigh more than I ever have. And if you look at me, you wouldn't think that, but on a scale, I am the most I've ever weighed. So if my BMI is telling me a certain number, people are looking at me and they're going to be like, well, that doesn't make sense. So, but weight is going to be more if you have a larger muscle mass, and that doesn't take into account for muscle mass. So a single BMI for age is not useful. And people, a lot of clinicians use it to assess for fat because we know excessive fat on someone's body, especially, midline fat, can be increased risk for diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol. So going back to that lifestyle, right? It's looking at the build. So when I come in and see a patient, it's looking at the overall build, looking at the family history and the build in the family, and then also just doing a full exam and talking about that lifestyle, talking about the nutrition and the exercise like we discussed. But it is a racially biased tool. It doesn't have a lot of good utility, especially in children. I don't even like it in adults. I think it's not very helpful, but in children, it really has no place, and it can lead to more stress for parents. Parents coming into me from their schools where they do BMI testing or weight testing, panicking that their child is overweight and they have to put their kid on a diet. And it leads to disordered body image issues and also potentially disordered eating when we see these BMIs be listed as underweight, overweight, and parents are panicking with what they need to do for their kid when their kid is actually very healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I said before I was overweight as a little girl, and my mom, when I was older and grew out of it, she said, like, I would tell your Grammy all the time, oh my gosh, she just won't stop eating. And I'm so worried about her, and she's going to be so heavy. And my biological dad's side of the family has a lot of heavier people on it. And she just knew that they have health issues. Like, she wasn't worried so much about how I looked, but that I wasn't going to be healthy. And my Grammy always told her, she's going to have a growth spurt. She's going to have a growth spurt. And then my daughter has always, had a heavier build than a lot of her friends. And then you go through puberty and you shoot up, like, your body has a reason for holding on to these things. And by the way, if anyone's listening to this and they're interested in what you were talking about with BMIs in adults, we did an episode, go back and listen to it, guys, for weight gain in pregnancy. And we had a midwife on talking about BMI and how it is racist inherently. And it doesn't mean that you can't give birth out of hospital and why they even talk about it. So just a little plug to go back to an older episode if anyone's interested in that as well.
Yeah, and this shows up in so many ways. I think about when families come in and they are so worried about their child. You can have a young, vibrant child who plays outside, eats varied food, enjoys a bit of sweets, but don't we all, right? That's something that we all love. And they're on the higher percentile. So then the parent starts removing sweets in an effort for the child to lose weight. And this is because they were called overweight at a doctor's office. Going back to the very first question that you asked me, is that the doctor says, well, you need to lose weight. And that is not appropriate, right? So the removal of these sweets creates an unhealthy relationship with sweets. And then the child craves it, goes to a birthday party, binges it. The family isn't learning moderation. The family isn't learning how to not place sweets on a pedestal, or worse, taking it off the table and making it taboo. And sugar is a part of our life. Like, we can't avoid sugar, and we need to teach our children moderation and that every food has a place, right? And then take the same scenario. We have a young, vibrant child who is physically active, eats varied food, enjoys a bit of sweets, but is on the lower percentile. And this is why it exists for higher and lower percentile children. The parent is told, well, you know what? Your child is underweight. Or failure to thrive. And so we really have to, watch that. And then parents are like, what do you mean watch that? What do I have to do to bulk my kid up? And what happens, and I see this, is that now they're pushing all this food on this child. It creates also disordered eating, right? The child doesn't want to eat this, doesn't want to eat this. There's pressure at the dining table to to consume the food, finish your plate. And now this child is getting loaded with, usually, and this is what happened in my childhood, carbs, sweets, all these foods that are really overall in balance, fine, but it ends up being this disordered eating of, you got to finish your plate. You're too skinny. You're too skinny. You need to finish this. And both children have now created disordered eating habits and now have created a negative body image because of the way that we communicated food, the way we communicated that being tied to how a child looks. And that goes back to the parents, but also the clinicians, to be very clear on health and balance and how we show up to the dining table, because there's no denying that meals and weight are coinciding. And I see this all the time, that parents get so stressed with meals if their child is losing weight. They get so stressed with meals if their child is overweight, because they're like, well, my kid, like you said perfectly, well, she's eating too much. I'm like, but does she understand cues? What are they doing there? That is something that's very healthy, and that child needs the calories, and that is okay. But we don't want to create those issues inadvertently by this messaging that we give our kids.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my own family growing up. I'm one of 5, and my brothers are very close in age. They're 18 months apart. And one of them has always been he was 10 pounds when he was born, and he's kind of stayed on that trajectory his whole life. And he would go through growth spurts, and we would see it. We always knew when he was about to shoot up, because he would kind of grow out and then he'd stretch, and he'd grow out and then he'd stretch. And it's funny to watch that with my own kids now, because I see that they kind of bulk up and then they stretch out. But then my other brother, he was diagnosed with failure to thrive when he was little, and he's always been on this very low percentile. And my mom, thankfully, having 5 children, was always very level-headed about it. She's like, well, he's on his growth chart, so I'm fine with that. But watching the two of them when I was growing up was just so interesting, because they both did all the same things. They ate all the same things, and they just had completely different body types. That was just how they were. It's still how they are. One of them's a string bean and one of them's bigger. And that's how they've done it. And it's fine.
And I love it. It's in the same family, the same genetics, right? I mean, the same siblings. Exactly. And that is so healthy to have that mom who in my opinion, like really understood, because I'll be honest, I see more times than not that there's stress around that, right? Well, my other siblings or my other children look like this. And I'm like, it's same thing with everything, right? You guys know, like the feeding can be different. The behavior's different. Everyone is different, even within twins. And so I love that you brought that story up, because it is very valid that it's going to look different. And we have to be in the mindset of celebrating the child in front of us in all aspects, whether it's weight, whether it's behavior, development, academics, so that we can really let them thrive on their own trajectory.
Exactly.
It's hard not to get wrapped up in that as a parent, because I was that parent. My daughter was like, she would eat and she did all the things. Like I was never worried about her. Both of my kids were in the 8-pound range. She was in the higher 8s. He was in the lower 8s, but he lost 11% of his birth weight right when he was born. And so then I was worried all the time, and I was, stressing about my breast milk and am I getting enough?
Yes,
and first it starts with you, and you're trying to get enough to give to your baby. And then at the dinner table, I have one who she looks normal. She's totally fine. And I don't really worry about her. And then I'm like, what fat can I add to my son's food to like bulk him up, just keep him full and he'll eat forever. The amount of food this child eats and how skinny he is not congruent, you guys.
Yes.
So
I feel the same. Oh, my daughter both of my children are lean. Okay. I like to use that terminology. They're lean, like me and my husband are. And my daughter, though, I breastfed my daughter and I formula fed my son, and my son's older. And I had the same feeling when I was breastfeeding my daughter. I felt she was very petite, much more petite than my son was as an infant. And I went down those rabbit holes, even though I know better of my breast milk isn't enough, right? Like I'm not doing enough. And she would just stop at like 2 ounces of breast milk. And my son would formula feed 6 ounces at that age of formula, right? So my brain was like, why is she not eating? This is breast milk. Why is she not eating? And my husband's like, Mona, she's full. She's fine. And I'm like, she's not gaining weight. And I had such bad anxiety postpartum. I would actually sneak into my office, because I have my office like during business hours, swipe in and weigh her because I was so anxious about her weight. And I tell the story because it's real. Like I had that anxiety, and it took people externally, whether it was my colleague or my husband or our nanny, to say, Mona, she's full. Like she doesn't want anymore. And when she started eating, this girl is a garbage disposal. Like I can literally keep throwing food at her, and she is so lean, just like me and just like my husband. And it's so important to remember that. And I think we forget that as parents, right? We forget that we also have the same build, likely, right? If these are our genetic children, that they're going to be the same like us. And I asked the parents, I'm like, tell me what build you had as a child. Tell me, like, what do you remember? And they're like, I don't know. Like my mom said I was, super petite and that I would eat everything. I'm like, then why are we worried so much about your child, And sometimes it may not be something that you remember, or sometimes it may not be the case, but it really goes down to looking at that big picture, which we'll get into, of what that child is doing, rather than worrying so much about, oh my God, because stress at the dinner table is the worst thing we can do. And we know that, right? We know that it leads to way more issues. We know that it just doesn't make it enjoyable for anyone at that dinner table when we're worried about them eating too much or too little, right? And like you said, it's our perception of what we think they should look like and what we deem as healthy. And the funny thing is, it's like we want our children to be like, we want babies to be chunky, right? Everyone's like, oh, we want a chunky baby, like really chubby baby. But then the narrative is switched once they become school age, right? And then everyone's like, well, you don't want a chunky child. I'm like, no, but maybe that's the child. Maybe that's their build. And so it's funny how that is societally created, that babies are supposed to be chubby. And then somehow magically we snap our fingers and now we're all supposed to be lean supermodels. That's not body type. That's not how we should look at our bodies, because everyone is different. And I'm so into body positivity on all spectrums, right? I think we sometimes forget that lean people struggle with body image. And I'm really big on that, because I have a lot of teenage boys and girls come in who are being teased like that they need to gain more weight, and they can't gain weight. That's just not their build. And they're healthy, but they're being teased for being scrawny, for being, string beans and bean poles and all the terminology, when it is actually just as hurtful, because I see it in my office as being called overweight or all that stuff. And it's sad. It's a sad reality that I hope we can really change with this episode and with the work that we do.
That was me and my best friend. She was so skinny and I was heavy. We joked that we were friends through thick and thin. I was the thick and she was the thin. And she would sit there and try to eat. I remember her trying to binge an entire bag of peanut M&Ms because she was just trying to gain weight. And people would make fun of her, like tell her she looked like a boy and, oh, are you turned around? Oh no, I guess that is your front. It looks like your back. Like just so mean to her. And then they would make fun of me and call me names saying that I was fat. And it's like, you can't win. You cannot win. Either one, you're going to be made fun of.
It is so hard, right? I mean, and going back to her binge eating M&Ms, that is literally my childhood, right? I would binge eat unhealthy foods, like processed packaged foods. And that is not healthy for me. Like I had to undo that addiction to like processed foods. And not that I'm saying that processed foods in moderation is bad, but we know that you're not supposed to eat M&Ms every day, all day, every day. Or for me, it was like chips, right? I would just think that, oh, well, I'm skinny and this will bulk me up and give me curves. And it's so hurtful, right? And you and your friend are prime example of how, like you said, there's no win-win. It's like everyone's going to have a comment. And so people just really need to shut their mouth a little bit.
little bit.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
It's okay. It's okay. So what would you say are some takeaways that we can give parents for creating, positive body image and good relationships with food for our children so that they hopefully don't have to go through some of this that we did growing up?
I love this. And this could be an entire book or episode. But first of all, know the unhealthy relationship signs. So this is for food and for body image. You feel guilty when you eat. So just say you have a cookie, right? If you're feeling guilty for having a cookie, you really need to dive into why are you feeling guilty for this one cookie? I had ice cream with my son yesterday. There was no guilt. We enjoyed it. We know that this is something that's enjoyable and that he loves ice cream. So first, look at your feelings around food. You're avoiding for certain foods because they're considered bad to you. And so that becomes, a pedestal issue. You are calorie counting to the point of obsession where you are going into this, well, I have to do this and I can't go over this calorie. Now, if you are following with a nutritionist, this advice may vary, right? Because they may have you do calorie counting if you are dealing with certain medical issues or whatnot. But this is for just general information. Ignoring hunger cues. So you're hungry and you drink water because you think that, okay, I don't need to eat. And then dieting fads and immense stress around meal times. You're just worried about food. You're worried about what your child's eating, like I mentioned. So how can we create these healthy relationship of food and body image? The number one thing for me is speaking positively about our bodies in front of our children and what they do and not how they look like. So I don't mind if you want to celebrate the curves you have or the fact that your body looks a certain way, but I want you to really instill on your children that my body is really strong, that I am doing this, I'm working out, I'm eating better because then that way I can play with my children. That way I can lift up things. That way I can do these amazing things, walk fast, run fast, versus that it looks a certain way. This is key. And the only way our children are going to learn that is how we speak about our bodies, how we speak about other people. So we are not going to look at, well, look at that person. That person's so skinny or that person's so fat, right? We're not ever going to talk like that. We are going to speak positively about bodies. Look how strong she looks. Look how fast he is. Look how amazing she's feeling, right? We want to really embody that for our children and model that body positivity. The next thing is we do not want to put food on pedestals or shame foods. So remember that different foods have different purposes. Like I mentioned with the ice cream, like I mentioned with cookies, like I mentioned with packaged foods, all of these things serve a purpose in our life. So we do not want to put it on a pedestal or shame our children for having the desire. My son has a really strong sweet tooth. It's incredible because my daughter does not, but I've seen this since my son started solids. He could down so much sweet foods. And rather than saying, stop wanting cookies all day, I say, what is it that you love so much about cookies, sweetie? He's like, they just taste so good, mommy. What is it? He's like, I just love it. It tastes so sweet and yummy. And I'm like, I understand. I love cookies too. And so let's see, we can maybe have some cookies later today. And he's like, oh yes, I would love that. So there's no pedestal or shaming my child for loving it. And you know what he does? He stops eating it when he's full because he's not in a culture of, well, I can't ever have cookies. He knows that mommy will give him cookies, but that there's no taboo there. So he'll eat as much as he wants and he'll leave some behind. And that's how I know he's creating a healthy relationship with food, is that he's not just binging and shoving it in his mouth and getting that dopamine hit and just being like, okay, now I got my fix. No, it's ordered eating here. The next thing is we do not want to force feed, and we want to respect hunger cues and fullness cues for our children. So this starts from the moment they start solid foods. And this is a way for them being mindful with their eating, not forcing them to finish the plate, not forcing them to have that one more bite. This is how we create a healthy relationship with food. And then also don't use food as a reward or punishment. So food should never be a reward. It should never be a punishment. Just say your child does get an award at school. You can go out for ice cream, but you're not going to say, well, you know what? You got this award. And so if you get awards, we're going to get ice cream. You're going to say, you know what? Today's an amazing day. Let's go out and have some pizza and ice cream today. And you can have that be an enjoyable thing that you do together, but don't attach rewards with the food. And also don't remove food because they aren't behaving or acting well, because food is part of our life. It's not a their behavior should not dictate food. And then the last thing is mindful eating. And this is a huge thing where we are being very mindful when we eat. We're not forcing them to scarf down their food. We're trying to minimize screen use with meal times. I know some parents may find that difficult, but to be a mindful eater, you have to be focused on the task in front of you, not watching TV, not scrolling our phones for us as well. We are eating slowly. We are chewing. We are taking that food down. And if you look at infants and toddlers eating without a screen, this is the example of mindful eating. They're very methodical. They pick the food up, they put it in their mouth, they taste it, they let it go down. The speed that they're eating is very mindful. And that is how we can be better at understanding our cues versus eating in the kitchen and scarfing down food really fast because we don't have time. And so modeling mindful eating at least one time a day at dinner time with your children, telling them about that, showing how you're eating slowly, encouraging them to taste the food, feel the flavors, and talk about what they like and don't like so that we can have this healthy relationship with food and their bodies as well.
I love those things. And I just want to add one thing is that if you're a parent listening and you're like, I've already screwed up big time, just know that like, there's always a time where you can change this. Like you've not done too much or you've not done enough. You can change it because my kids are 7.5 years apart and I for sure did not do this right with my daughter at all. And at 3, I let her she wanted a bunch of Halloween candy and I let her eat as much as she wanted because she's always like, I just didn't want to fight. And she made herself sick to the point of puking. And then here I have my son who is 7.5 years younger, and it's funny, he will even share bites of his favorite things with you. And I'm always surprised. I'm like, my daughter never would have given me a bite of her favorite thing ever. And he also will leave the sweet on his plate. Like he won't finish the ice cream cone because he's done, which she never would have done. And she made herself sick. And it has a lot to do with the way that I modeled food at those ages. I mean, I wouldn't even sit down and eat the ice cream with her because it wasn't a healthy choice for me, And now I'm like, I'm eating that ice cream with my son because I don't want him to see that like, I'm unwilling to just enjoy something with him, So don't feel bad, parents, if you're out there and going, I think I've already screwed up. It's not too late.
Parenting is a lifelong game. I say that all the time. Like you are not done. And exactly, this is all about finding things that you like from this conversation and finding things that you like from articles you read and saying, this sounds great. I can change that. And that is the beauty of having children. It's never too late to, change what you want to do. And I think it's a beautiful example of what you mentioned because it is something that parents feel like, well, I can't pivot. You can always pivot if you want. And there's always a solution to find a new path.
Absolutely. I think that's so huge too. Just recognizing across the spectrum of parenting, you can always change it up. You can always try new things. We're not stuck just because that's how we always did it. And that applies to so many aspects of parenting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if someone listening wants to find more information about you or your offerings, how can they find you?
Yeah. So my website is my hub, PedsDocTalk, PedsDoctalk.com. Instagram is amazing. So PedsDocTalk on Instagram or TikTok. I'm more active on Instagram. And I do have courses, nothing directly related to BMI or weight, to having these discussions, which is why I'm glad to be able to go on shows to talk about these very important topics. But I do have courses for tantrums and feeding and sleep and a lot of different things. And just a lot of free resources with my YouTube and my podcast as well. And I just really like to share these messages around having a healthy relationship with food, body image, sleep, and our emotions, that we can raise these children that have a strong sense of self, a strong sense of self-worth, and a really strong sense of self-love for their bodies and themselves. And that's my mission. So come join the family at PedsDocTalk.
Thank you so much. I love that. And we will also add all of those in the show notes for those of you listening, if you want to just click and be able to have a direct link to her. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We loved this conversation and we hope to chat with you again soon.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Birth, Baby. Thanks again to Longing for Orpheus for our music. You can look him up on Spotify. Remember to leave a review, share, and follow wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.